Buckle up, because today we are diving deep into a case that'll make you think twice about justice and perception. We're looking at Jolene Castile.
Oh, Ian Castile.
Yeah, she's a celebrity chef in New York City. And she shot a black teenager, Maude Carter, claiming self-defense.
Oh, wow. This is going to be interesting.
It is. We'll be looking at this case through the lens of a fictional crime drama that really digs into some serious issues about, well, racial bias in America.
Okay, I'm hooked already.
Yep.
So, is it open and shut self-defense, or is there something more to it?
Well, that's what we're here to figure out. What jumps out at me right away is how this whole thing really shows the impact of living in a high crime area, you know?
Yeah.
Like, how does that constant fear, that vulnerability, change how we see the world, especially when a certain group of people is constantly being pointed to as the bad guys?
That's a really important point. You start to wonder, does that environment, that feeling of being unsafe, does it affect how someone reacts in a stressful situation? Like, does it warp their perception of what's actually happening?
Exactly. But before we get to that night, I'm curious, does knowing that Jolene legally carried a concealed weapon, does that change your first impression of her?
That's a tough one. On one hand, she's within her rights, right?
Yeah.
But on the other hand, it makes you think, especially knowing the context. Rapes terrorizing her neighborhood, victims all describing a young black man as the attacker. It creates this atmosphere of fear, no doubt. But it also makes you ask, did Jolene maybe subconsciously start seeing danger where there wasn't any?
Okay, so let's paint the picture. Jolene Castile, successful chef, lives in a beautiful brownstone on the Upper West Side, the picture of success. But this string of rapes changes everything. It makes sense that people would be on edge, looking over their shoulders.
Totally, and that's precisely the argument the defense uses later on.
Yeah.
They say her fear was totally reasonable given what was going on. It's the classic stand your ground defense, the idea that she had every right to use deadly force if she felt threatened.
Break that down for me, though. Stand your ground, what does that actually mean in the eyes of the law?
Well, stand your ground laws basically say you don't have to try to run away if you think your life's in danger. You don't have to try and calm things down or anything. You can use force right then and there.
And that applies in any situation where someone feels threatened.
Yeah, that's the idea. But it's also been criticized. Some people say it just makes things more violent, that people jump to using force too quickly.
Yeah, it's a bit of a double-edged sword, isn't it? It's supposed to protect people, but it could also lead to more violence. So how does Jolene's case fit into this whole stand your ground thing?
That's the jury had to figure out. Was Jolene truly afraid of Maude, this young black man walking behind her? Or was it more about the story everyone was telling about the rapist? Did the stereotypes about black men in crime, did that cloud her judgment?
It's tough, right? How can you separate someone's genuine fear from their own biases? It's like you'd have to be inside their head.
It's really complicated.
Yeah.
But the law uses this idea of a reasonable person, Would a reasonable person in Jolene's shoes, seeing what she saw, would they have felt threatened enough to shoot? The prosecution said, no way. Especially because Maude wasn't armed and he had those earbuds in. He probably couldn't even hear her.
So there's this clash between Jolene's personal experience of being afraid and this idea of what a reasonable person would do. It seems like everything comes down to how the jury saw that difference.
Exactly. And the fact that they sided with Jolene, that they said she wasn't guilty, well, it really says something about how powerful the self-defense story is, especially when race is involved. Makes you wonder if maybe some unconscious bias played a part in their decision.
Yeah, that's a heavy thought. Okay, so we've got this legal framework of stand your ground and this idea of reasonable fear, both crucial in Jolene's case. Now take us to that night. What actually went down?
It's late. Jolene's walking home from some kind of charity event. She sees Maude Carter walking behind her, and he's got a hoodie on.
And that hoodie, that's a key detail, right? Because it's what everyone's picturing the rapist wearing.
Yeah, it becomes this symbol of danger in her mind. You can see how her anxiety would go through the roof.
So what does she do?
Jolene shouts at him to back off. She feels threatened. But here's where things get murky. Jolene says Maude kept coming toward her. She thought he had a gun, so she shot him. Self-defense, she says.
But we know Maude didn't have a gun, and he had those earbuds in. It's possible he didn't even register that she was yelling at him. That's just awful.
Awful and problematic. Remember that reasonable person standard? The prosecution jumped all over that. They said a reasonable person would have thought, hey, maybe he didn't hear me. Maybe he's not trying to hurt me. Plus, the forensics backed them up. The bullet's path suggested Maude was shot from a distance, not up close like Jolene said.
Hold on, so the physical evidence doesn't match up with her story. Now things are getting really interesting.
Right. The prosecution used that to say Jolene's view of what happened was distorted, that her fear might have been blown out of proportion by this stereotype of the black man as a predator.
And that's where the whole issue of racial bias slams right into this case. You can't ignore the fact that Jolene, a white woman, shot a black teenager.
No, you absolutely can't. This case became a flashpoint for all those discussions about racial profiling and excessive force. You can't separate what individuals do from the bigger picture, from the history that's already there. What happened to Maud, it feeds into this long and terrible pattern of black men being seen as threats, sometimes with deadly consequences.
So at first glance, it might look like self-defense, but then you dig a little deeper and you see these huge societal issues, race and perception, and they turn everything upside down.
Yeah, it goes way beyond just Jolene and Maud. It shines a light on how the police operate, too. Back then, New York City was in the middle of a huge controversy over its stop-and-frisk policy.
Right, stop and frisk, where cops could stop and search anyone on the street if they thought there was a reasonable suspicion, which a lot of people said was just a way to target people without real evidence.
Exactly. And it ended up with way more black and Latino men being stopped and searched, even when they weren't doing anything wrong. The defense, they used that to their advantage, you know. They said Jolene was just doing what the police were doing.
Wow, that's a pretty bold move. They're basically saying if the cops can stop and frisk black men just because they look suspicious, then Jolene can shoot one based on her gut feeling.
It's a dangerous argument, but it tapped into people's fears about crime and race.
Yeah.
And it makes you think, does a policy like that, one that unfairly targets a certain group, does it create an environment where people feel like they can take the law into their own hands, even if it leads to someone dying?
That's a lot to unpack. We've got a celebrity chef, self-defense, an unarmed black teenager. We've got stand your ground, reasonable fear, racial bias, and stop and frisk. My head's spinning.
And we're just getting started.
So much to think about already. And you said there's even more to this case. What else is there?
Well, while everyone's focused on Jolene and the shooting, the police are still trying to catch the rapist. And get this, their main suspect at the time. It was Maud Carter.
Wait, what? The kid Jolene shot, the one with the earbuds, he was a suspect in the rapes? I don't even know what to say to that.
It's a crazy twist, right? Like,
Yeah.
did Jolene accidentally stop a serial rapist?
Mm-hmm.
The police had two victims who picked Maud out of a lineup, and his phone records put him near where the rapes happened. It looked really bad for him.
So you're saying some people might have thought Jolene was a hero if that had come out sooner?
It's possible, right?
Yeah.
Imagine that information coming out during the trial. Would it have changed how the jury saw Jolene's fear? It's a disturbing thought.
It's like a giant what if hanging over the whole thing.
Yeah.
But hold on, you said the police had pretty solid evidence against Maud. Did they ever actually charge him?
No, they didn't. And that's where things take another turn. While they were investigating Maud, they found another guy, Willie Taylor. He had just gotten out of prison for, you guessed it, sexual assault.
Okay, so now there's a second suspect. What made them think Willie Taylor was the rapist? Was it just his past, or was there something more?
Willie Taylor became the prime suspect when his DNA matched all three rapes. And then the victims remembered something specific, this faint smell of cooking oil on the attacker's clothes. Turns out, Willie Taylor had just started working at a fast food place.
So DNA plus a detail that checked out, that sounds pretty airtight. What happened to Maud once they had Willie Taylor?
With Willie Taylor in custody and all that evidence against him, Maud was totally cleared. The case against him just fell apart. But the tragedy is, he didn't survive the shooting. So the focus shifted. It wasn't about whether Jolene was right or wrong to shoot at Maud. It became about whether she should have shot at all.
And that brings us right back to those original questions, doesn't it? Was it self-defense or was it about race? Did Jolene see Maud as a threat because he was black, especially with all the fear from the rapes? And even if she did think he was the rapist, did his race make her more likely to shoot?
Yeah, those questions were at the heart of the trial in this case. It blew up. It became this huge national debate about race, fear, and deadly force. The media just made everything more intense. Some people were saying Jolene was a victim who did what she had to do. Others said she was a vigilante, that it was about race.
So it's this public fight over whose story is the right one. What about the trial itself? What evidence did each side present?
The prosecution had a strong case. They focused on those forensics that contradicted Jolene's story. Remember how the bullet path suggested Maud was shot from farther away, like she had more time to think, to maybe try something else besides shooting?
That seems like a good point for the prosecution. It makes it harder to believe Jolene was in immediate danger, which is what you need for a self-defense claim to work. What else did the prosecution bring up?
They also kept talking about how Maud wasn't armed, and he had those earbuds in. They said he probably didn't even hear Jolene yelling at him. They painted this picture of Maud as this innocent kid just walking home, not knowing that Jolene was scared of him because of what everyone was saying about the rapist.
So the prosecution's saying Jolene overreacted, that she didn't act like a reasonable person. How did the defense fight back against that?
The defense. They had a tough job, but they came up with a pretty clever strategy. They didn't deny the forensics or that Maud wasn't armed. Instead, they focused on making Jolene seem like the victim. They said she was just reacting to the situation, that her fear was understandable.
What do you mean, a victim?
They said she was living in a place where everyone was scared because of the rapes. People were constantly on edge, especially women. And they pointed out that the police were still looking for the guy, which just added to the feeling that something bad could happen.
So they're basically saying even if what Jolene did wasn't the best choice, anyone would have been scared in her shoes. Did they ever talk about the race issue directly?
They did, but they used it to try and take the blame off Jolene. Remember that stop and frisk policy? They brought that up, saying even the police, with all their training and resources, were using racial profiling to try and catch the rapist.
It's like they're saying if the police can stop and frisk black men without real proof, Jolene shouldn't be held to a higher standard. They're connecting her actions to what the police were doing, saying both came from the same place: fear and racial bias.
Exactly. It was risky, but it played on people's anxieties about crime and race. And they took it even further, using things from Jolene's past to build their case.
What do you mean? Like that discrimination lawsuit we talked about earlier?
Yep. They brought up testimony from that lawsuit, where people who used to work for Jolene said she made racist comments and treated black employees unfairly.
Wouldn't that make it seem like Jolene was more likely to be racist?
You'd think so, right? But the defense used it to paint a different picture. They said these incidents, even if they were bad, showed that Jolene wasn't afraid to stand up for herself, that she would take action if she felt threatened. They made her seem like a strong woman who wouldn't let herself become a victim.
It's amazing how the same piece of evidence can be twisted to fit different stories. So we've got the prosecution going for a conviction, sticking to the facts, and the defense playing on the jury's emotions, making them see Jolene as a woman who was just trying to protect herself. What happened? Did the jury believe the defense?
Well, sadly for Maude Carter's family, and for anyone who wanted to see justice done, the jury found Jolene not guilty.
I can't imagine how Maud's family must have felt. Their son was dead, his name had been dragged through the mud, and the woman who killed him walked free. It feels like the system failed them completely. How did people react to the verdict?
People were furious. There were protests all over the city. People were saying it was a miscarriage of justice, that the system protected a white woman and let a young black man down. Some people wanted the DA to appeal the verdict or file new charges, but nothing happened. The legal system had made its decision, and that was it.
It just shows that even when the facts seem clear, the legal system is complicated and sometimes doesn't make sense. And with race, fear, and self-defense all mixed up in this case, it was even harder to figure out.
Absolutely. And even though the trial is over, the effects of this case on the people involved, on the community, and on this whole conversation about race and justice in America, those effects are going to last a long time.
I can only imagine what Maud's family went through after that verdict. Their son is gone, his reputation was tarnished, and then Jolene, the woman who shot him, is found not guilty. It's hard to see that as anything but a failure of the system.
It's a really tough outcome, no doubt. And it makes you think about how hard it is to get justice when the system itself is full of biases. Jolene might be in the clear legally, but there are still questions about whether what she did was right.
Right, and even though the criminal case is closed, Jolene still had that civil suit from Maud's family hanging over her. That had to be stressful, even after being found not guilty.
Oh, absolutely. That civil suit brought a whole different set of problems. Now, it wasn't about proving she was guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. It was about whether she was careless, whether she had a responsibility to be more careful around Maud, and whether that carelessness led to his death. There's a different way of looking at it.
So it's not about intent anymore. It's about who's responsible for what happened. Did that civil suit ever go to trial? What happened?
We don't actually know the details of the civil suit. It probably ended up being settled out of court, with Jolene paying Maud's family some money. Those kinds of settlements are usually kept secret. It's a way to give everyone some closure without having another public trial.
It's a reminder that justice can mean different things to different people. Sometimes it's about punishment, but sometimes it's about acknowledging the harm that was done and trying to make things right, even if it's just with money. This case obviously had a huge impact on everyone involved. What happened to Jolene after the trial?
Even though she was found not guilty, Jolene's life was completely changed. She was in the spotlight, with some people calling her a hero for standing up for herself, and others saying she was a dangerous vigilante. Her career, everything she had built, had all fell apart because of what happened. She pretty much disappeared, became a recluse,
Yeah.
haunted by that night.
It just goes to show that even if the law is on your side, taking a life, even if you think you had to do it, it can have really serious consequences. Did Jolene ever talk about how she felt after the shooting? Did she ever say she was sorry for Maud's death?
There's this one scene in the crime drama that gives you a glimpse into what Jolene was going through. She goes to the hospital to see Maud's mother and tells her how sorry she is for what happened. But she still insists that she didn't do anything wrong, that she was scared and had no other choice but to shoot.
It's such a complicated and sad situation. She's relieved that she's not going to jail, but she's also carrying the weight of knowing she killed someone. The law can't really fix something like that.
No, it can't. This case really shows the limitations of the legal system, how it can't always deal with the human side of these tragedies. There's no perfect solution, no easy answers. It just leaves us with these questions about justice, perception, and how deeply racial bias is woven into our society.
This whole deep dive into Jolene Castile's case has been a lot. We've gone through the legal ins and outs of self-defense, how racial bias shapes how we see danger, and how one action can have such huge consequences. It's a lot to absorb. What are your final thoughts on this? What should our listeners take away from all of this?
I think this case is a huge wake-up call. It shows how our own biases, the things we see and hear, and the anxieties we have about society, all of that can affect how we see things. It makes us look at our own beliefs, to question what we think we know, and to understand how dangerous it can be when fear and prejudice get in the way of making good decisions.
It also shows how important it is to think critically, especially when we're hearing about these kinds of cases in the news. We have to be aware that there might be bias in the way things are reported, in the way the story is presented, and we have to be willing to look at things from different sides to understand that it's complicated and to resist the urge to make it all black and white.
Absolutely. This case isn't a simple story with good guys and bad guys. It's a reflection of how messy things are in the real world, how we're all dealing with these issues of race, fear, and the use of force. It's a call to be more aware, to be more empathetic, and to work toward changing the systems that create injustice.
It's definitely heavy stuff, but we need to keep talking about it. So as you go about your day, think about what this case brings up. How do our perceptions influence our actions? How do fear and prejudice affect how we react when we feel threatened? And how can we, as individuals and as a society, build a world where tragedies like this don't happen as often? It might not be easy to find the answers, but it's so important that we keep looking for them.
Jolene Castile's story, even though it's fiction, it holds up a mirror to our own world. It makes us face uncomfortable truths about justice in a world where race, perception, and fear all collide in ways that can be unexpected and really damaging.
It's been a tough but important deep dive. Thanks for joining us. Keep thinking about these issues, keep talking about them, and keep challenging yourselves to see the world with more understanding